Hi, this is Helen Thomas and the CDFM Study Group. Welcome as I get ready to review the 2018 study guide for CDFM Module 2, Competency Area 1, which is the defense budget process. Now, there are a lot of moving pieces in the defense budget process, so it's important that you understand the process. The processes, the key individuals involved, key players, and the documents being produced. So who sends what document, who prepares what document is important to understand in this area. So it starts off with looking at the mission of the Department of Defense, the history of how you came with the Army, the Navy. So I'm not going to focus on those particular things that you can identify. Beginning on page 10, it gives you the chart of the hierarchy as far as the various departments in the Department of Defense. And a lot of those are going to become important because as you talk about the ppbe process, planning, programming, budgeting, and execution, which is the DoD resource allocations and resource allocation system, you're going to have to know which office in the Department of Defense is responsible for a particular process. So that's why this chart's going to come into play. And if you look on page 11, it actually gives you a list of a lot of those Office of Secretariats that fall under the Department of Defense. And so we're going to look at a few of those. So let's begin with the Joint Chiefs of Staff. So I'm not necessarily going to be announcing every page because I'm trying to get away from that. Kind of want to read it as a story. So you start up at the top. You have Congress, you have the Joint Chief of Staff, you have the President. Who else you have up there? The Director of CIA Intelligence and so forth. And so what's the mission of the Joint Chief of Staff? Remember, your president is a civilian, your Secretary of Defense is a civilian, your top military advisor to the SecDef and the president is the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff. So your Joint Chief of Staff are representative from various services, the Army, the Navy, the Air Force. All of those are Joint Chiefs of Staff. Their chairman, their commander of those joint staff is the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff. So the function of the chairman, since he's a top military uniform guy or gal, is to advise the Secretary of Defense and the President and the National Security Council, which we're going to talk about in a little bit, about military operations, about how we can use military resources to combat a particular threat. So that's their function. As you read through that, you'll see what I'm talking about. And so then you also have another key player is the combatant commander. So why is the Department of Defense even here? Why is the Army, Navy to provide these forces to deter our enemies, to deter whatever threat the country faces? Hence, you have combatant commanders, which are responsible for particular regions of the globe, basically, because you have your Pacificom, your Northcom, CENTCOM, and so forth. So I'm not going to be repeating those. It says 10 unified combatant commands. And understand that operational chain of command, because of the reason for the Department of Defense, operational chain of command runs from the President to the Secretary of Defense directly to the combatant commands. But does the President talk directly to the combatant commands? For the most part, they do not. Who do you think is that liaison between the combatant commanders, the President, and the Secretary of Defense? You're correct. That chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff, or that joint staff. The Army Joint Staff can talk to the Army assets, and the Navy Joint Staff can talk to the Navy assets. And then collectively, the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff will speak for each services. So the combatant commanders have priority when it comes to resources, because that's why we're here. Not just to occupy installations, we are here to support the warfighter to get the mission done. Hence, each warfighter is lined up with a combatant command, and priority of the combatant command comes first. So we talk about civilian control of the military and those combatant commands. Now, let's start from the top. You got the president, you got the secretary of defense. We talk about those two individuals, along with some other participants, make up the National Security Council. So the council, if you look, the standing members, meaning the primary members that make up the National Security Council, president, the secretary of the, all right, let's go down. President, vice president, secretary of defense, secretary of state, secretary of energy. Those five, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yes, so those 5 individuals are the primary members of the National Security Council. So what's this council for? Your National Security Council is that forum that comes together to analyze what types of threat this country faces. Then they determine the priority for the resources. What are we going to focus on? NORTHCOM, SOUTHCOM, all of it? What is going to be our focus? And as you can see, the advisors to the National Security Council, we already talked about the chairman of the Joint Staff, top military advisors to the president, the Secretary of Defense, and the National Security Council. You also have the Director of National Intelligence. So he brings the intelligence to the group, then they help to make the decisions. And then you have some participants that may participate in the whole process. Attorney General, you have your Treasury. We want to know if we have money to do this. You have the councils, your legal folks. Is this legal for us to do? So make sure you at least know the standing members, those advisors to that council, and a few of the participants who may participate. So what's the purpose of the National Security Council? When they're done doing their analysis of the threat level that the country faces, what's our focus going to be, they produce a document called the National Security Strategy. So if you could think of equivalent to an operation order, you have the big operation order that you get from your higher command. What do you typically do? You take that big op order, you go through it, and then you go to the part that talks about your organization to figure out what it is that you are required to do out of that operation order. And then the Department of Defense, the Secretary of Defense, does exactly that. They look at the national security strategy and then determine the defense strategy. Now, if you notice, there's a difference between the 2013 study guide and the 2018 in what the name of the DoD strategy document is. In the old, it used to be called the Quadrennial Defense Review, quad meaning 4, every 4 years. But now, in the 2018 study guide, it is called the National Defense Strategy. Actually, in a few years in the past, since I used to teach PEB, I know we used to have, it used to be called the National Defense Strategy. Then it went to the QDR. Now we're back to the NDS. So the DoD's document that talks about the DoD strategy in handling these situations is the National Defense Strategy. Should make it easy to remember. So big op order is National Security Strategy, DoD level, National Defense Strategy. And it does the same thing where they look at the big op order and then they pull out all the defense related things that the Department of Defense have to do to meet that national security strategy. Everything has to tie back. Now at the DoD level, remember, SecDef is not going to do it all by himself. No commander does. They have sub-staff members that produces certain documents. So you have the Defense Strategic Guidance, again, and also The important one here, because it's written by that top military advisor, is the National Military Strategy. So all the other documents were authored by either the Deputy Secretary of Defense or someone in the defense civilian-wise, but the National Military Strategy document, which is part of the defense strategy, is written by the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff. Does that make sense? Let me repeat that. Although the overall, just like when you write something and you give it to your commander, then the commander produces as their policy, their guidance. Likewise, all the other documents are written by representatives of the Secretary of Defense, such as your Defense Strategic Guidance, Strategy for Homeland Defense and Civil Support. The only document that mentioned in the study guide, it tells you who prepares it, because the other ones are all prepared by, it says, the Secretary of Defense. The only one that's developed by somebody else is the National Military Strategy. It's developed by the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff. Why? The chairman is the top guy in the uniform, so he knows what the military capabilities are and resources, so it makes sense that it's developed. But do we get policy from the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff? No. So then the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff needs to give that NMS document, National Military Strategy document, to the Secretary of Defense to be included as part of the National Defense Strategy, that 4-year document. Remember, QDR, no more for the 2018 study guide. It is now called the National Defense Strategy. NDS is done every 4 years, and it usually falls in line with the second year of a presidential election. So usually that 4-year doesn't end until that president comes in. That first year the president's there is the 4th year, and then the second term of the president is when a new QDR will come out. The PPBE overview, planning, programming, budget, and execution, articulates the strategy in the matter of resources. Now we know what our strategy is going to be. Now we need to know how we're going to pay for it, how we're going to resource, manpower. Do we have enough people, personnel, equipment? Do we have enough equipment to do this? So the PPBE process is what helps to do that. And in the previous study guides, you talked about the DoD resource systems. We talked about PPBE, JCITS, Joint Capabilities Integration and Development System, and the Defense Acquisition System. So all of those 3 systems overlap. If we don't already have it, JCITS, we identify that gap, capability gap. PPBE, we look to see if we already have it, how we're going to pay for it when we need to ask for the funding. And if we don't have it, then the Defense Acquisition System is where we acquire it. All right, so let's look now at some key officials and organization in the PPBE process. You have the USD Comptroller. Remember, this is a certified defense financial manager, so which means you're going to have to know at the DoD level who the key individuals are. So at the DoD level, the top budget resource manager is the USD Comptroller. Anytime you see a title begin with USD, Under Secretary of Defense, you know you're at the DoD level. You shouldn't select no answer that says ASA, FMNC, because that's at the Army level. The DoD exam primarily stops at the DoD level. So it has to be someone that starts off with the USD Comptroller. So that's your Chief Financial Officer. The senior budget person at the DoD level is the USD Comptroller. Who else do we have? So what's the Comptroller responsible for while we're here? The Comptroller is responsible for the budget and execution phase of the PPBE process. And you'll see that when you read through that. What else? We have the USD for policy, Undersecretary of Defense for policy. When it comes to the PPBE process, who are they responsible for? Conduct and coordinate the planning phase of the PPBE, planning, programming, budgeting, and execution. So we've already talked about budget and execution. The planning phase is the responsibility of the USD for policy. All right. What else? We have the USD AT&L, Undersecretary of Defense, Acquisition, Technology, and Logistics. That is your senior acquisition, since you got the word acquisition in there, is your specific for the DoD level, is your USD AT&L is the advisor to the Secretary of Defense on all acquisition related matters. And you'll see as we go through the acquisition process that they sit as chairman of particular boards. So I'm not going to go into that here. I don't want to confuse. We're just doing a quick overview of who this individual is. So we said for planning phase of PEB, responsibility of the USD for policy. We also said the USD comptroller is responsible for the budgeting and execution phase of PEB. So we missed one, right? Programming phase. So whose responsibility for programming? The Director of Cost Assessment and Program Evaluation, the DCAPE, is responsible for the programming phase of PEB. So that's going to be important for you to remember who is responsible for each one of those phases. The DCAPE, as you read through, you will see is anything to do with cost and cost analysis, cost benefit analysis. And also you hear the term the Future Year Defense Program. Future Year Defense Program, you'll talk about later, is that DoD database that keeps track of all the resources, the elements, the equipment, the manpower. All of those data is maintained by the Director of Cost Assessment Program Evaluation, the DCAPE. They continuously update the FYDP, and also he's responsible for the programming phase of PEB. And you'll see the DCAPE has some additional roles also in the acquisition process. So on page 27, it goes over those three DoD decision support systems. And as I said earlier, the difference here is in the 2013 study guide, in the middle, it said QDR. Now it says the National Defense Strategy, because collectively, we had the big op order, which was a national security strategy. Then we need at the DoD level to come up with the defense strategy, which is every 4 years. And it shows the three DoD support systems that we use to meet that national defense strategy. So we use the PPBE process, which we talked about, JCIDS, and the Defense Acquisition System. So you want to make sure that you know, as it looks on that chart on page 27, the PPBE's responsibility for the Deputy Secretary of Defense provides oversight. So who provides oversight of these systems? Then we talk about JCIDS, the Vice Chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff, who has a board, which is called the JROC, has oversight for JCIDS. And then the Defense Acquisition System. So who did we just say is the Senior Acquisition Executive at the DoD level? The USD AT&L. So you have to kind of keep that in mind as you're moving along. Okay, this new system. Who has oversight? Who's in charge of it? What is it? What does it do? These are questions you need to continuously ask yourself. So they give you a nice diagram on page 28, which talks about the different systems, where it starts with the NSS, National Security Strategy, down to the National Defense Strategy, with all the defense strategy document, the National Military Strategy produced by the Chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff. Then collectively, all of those documents is then pushed out by the SecDef. We get our policy guidance from the Secretary of Defense. And later we're going to talk about the defense planning guidance on the next page. So in the planning phase of PEB, which is basically what we're starting now, Secretary of Defense. And who do we say was responsible for the planning phase? Check on learning. The USD for policy. Remember that. You got to continuously remind yourself. So what is the policy guidance that is developed in the planning phase of PEB? It talks about defense strategic guidance, and then you utilizing the goals of that national defense strategy. We want to make sure we're meeting the goals. Everything got to stay in line. So the defense planning guidance will contain that fiscal constraints. Before we begin any process of developing plans, we need to have guidance. So you have the policies that are issued, and then you receive planning guidance to tell you what your constraints are when you begin the planning process. So the final document, once in the planning phase, it lasts about 18 to 20 months before that fiscal year begins. The final document that the DoD produces, because you know these things are going to go back and forth. So what I'm now running through for 18 to 20 months, I'm at the end now, at the 18th month or the 20th month, is the defense planning guidance. The final document that DoD pushes out to everyone is called the DPG, Defense Planning Guidance. And it goes through the process, all the different systems, national defense strategy, strategic guidance, all the documents that we mentioned earlier are then reviewed within that planning phase to make sure that everything stays in line with meeting the big op order, which is the national security strategy. All right, so it talks about joint strategic planning, all the different sources coming together with the combatant commander. The primary interaction between the combatant commanders and the military department is through the component commanders. Combatant commanders, with the exception of Special Operations Command, SOCOM, do not submit a POM, a Program Objective Memorandum, or their own budget request. So remember we talked about priority for resources go from the President's SecDef to the combatant commanders. However, those combatant commanders do not participate in the POM process and the budget estimate. They don't submit POM requests. They submit their requests directly to the Joint Chief of Staff and to the military component. If it's an Army asset they're needing, they're submitting it to the Army, then they submit it up to the Secretary of Defense for approval. So if they want to get it included in the POM process or budget, then they have to submit it to that component commander, whichever service they need it from. And the document produced by combatant commanders to send forward is called the Integrated Priority List. So anytime you hear Integrated Priority List, your next thought should be combatant commanders. You need to know who produced it. And that all they're doing is identifying what their needs are. So this is the essential part of passing this exam, is knowing, if I give you a document, you need to know who produced it. If I give you a process or a phase, you need to know who's responsible, who has oversight. So combatant commanders submit their requests to the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff, to the Secretary of Defense, to the component commanders. I want to give everybody a heads up on what I need. And that document is called the Integrated Priority List. And I think this is a good part to pause for the CDFM Module 2.1, the defense budget process, because this part is quite extensive. So this is the end of the planning phase. And then for the next video, I'm going to pick up with the programming phase of the ppbe process and kind of identify if I see any difference between the 2013 and the 2018 study guide. I'll kind of point that out, because some people may not want to buy the new study guide, but I will tell you, you need to buy the new study guide from the ASMC, because unlike previous editions of the study guide, they were just moving things around. Now they have actually changed some of the topics, and some of the names have changed also. So you're going to need to purchase the new study guide. So go ahead and do that, and then you'll be ready for 2019 when they start testing on the 2018 study guide. So thank you guys. Be sure that you subscribe so that you're able to get the updates as I continuously put new videos up. And I'll see you guys again next time.